It's a pleasure to have on the seeds today, Bohy. Bohy is the co-founder of Seam, a startup offering a device and brand-agnostic API for developers to control homes and buildings. Seam's IoT platform enables organizations to control building devices, like opening door locks, controlling thermostats, turning off lights, and more. Sai and his co-founder Don bring years of expertise from Nest and Sonder to progress the burgeoning building management industry. Welcome to the show.
Hey, pleasure to be here.
So here we are doing a virtual interview in the middle of the pandemic. Thankfully, we have technology to make this doable. Mm-hmm. Where are you calling from today?
San Francisco, where some of the last people left here, I guess.
But, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, no.
The two of us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What a time. So before we jump into building energy management and the exciting things that Seam is working on, I'd love if you could just introduce yourself. Where are you from? And then we'll get into your startup.
Sure. So I'm Sai. I originally, I was born in France, moved to the United States, I think when I was about 11 or 12. Basically moved to California at some point, went to school at Stanford where, this is where my co-founder Don and I kind of know each other from. Me personally, right after school, I joined Nest. So this was before the acquisition by Google. Really, really cool company to be in. It was kind of the dawn of the sort of the smart home to some extent. And I think a lot of things that followed afterward. And my co-founder and I, earlier in 2020, almost kind of at the start of the pandemic, we sort of, took an accounting of kind of the last 10 years of smart home and smart buildings and trying to understand like what's kind of holding it back. Not just on the consumer side, but also kind of on the, how can businesses basically better use IoT inside of homes and buildings? And the result of this is we ended up starting Seam.
Great. I'm excited to dive into all of those details in the next hour.
Yeah.
So we're going to structure this interview by focusing first on the building energy management context and then the startup. And then at the end, we'll track back and hear a little bit more about your personal journey. So to begin, my first question is, looking at the building energy management or building management system landscape holistically, what are smart building IoT devices doing well and not doing well? And if you could give our listeners a little explanation of like what building management systems are, and then we can get into how that's progressing.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to think of a building management system, a BMS, right? It's sort of the operating system for larger buildings, generally speaking. And it usually runs on some sort of terminal, like an old, Windows 2000 desktop in the basement. It's kind of dusty and grimy and whatever. And that's kind of the state of the IoT quote unquote space today for BMS. The BMS itself connects to a bunch of different devices throughout the building, like the HVAC system, potentially some of the elevators, security sensors, those sort of things. And I think like the more modern versions tend to have a little bit of cloud connectivity where you can sort of remotely monitor some of these, devices and subsystems. But for the most part, I think it's still pretty limited in terms of really what you can do with that remote sort of addressability of devices. So I think like when you ask like what is the industry doing well today, I mean they build good hardware, right? Like the buildings around us, the subsystems that are inside of them are not crumbling on us, right? Like they work, right? Like I'm warm in my house, like it's probably because it's working. The thing they don't do so well is, again, this idea that, at Nest, at least like, sort of almost 10 years ago now, we kind of came in and said like, hey, these devices, like we have to be able to control them from almost anywhere in the world. Like I can be sitting on a couch, in Japan and turning on the heat in my cabin in Tahoe, right? And it's like, it's kind of magical to think about this, but like, that was, pretty obvious that this is where, the future is going. And I think that the industry for sort of, BMS system and all the building subsystems is still kind of trying to reach to sort of that vision of like, every subsystem can be addressed in real time, can be controlled in real time, from anywhere in the world, basically. And I think that that's just going to take time for things to get there. It's just not the industry's expertise to build APIs and software systems like that.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right in that, building management systems have been around for a long time, relatively speaking. And Nest, for example, is a quite advanced application of that or example of that. But the ways that we have thermostats and things, these are not new technologies necessarily. But what is new is that advanced automation and holistic communication between all of these disparate devices, which leads me to my next question of why is the holistic integration and communication between smart building devices so necessary for the, let's start with just like the electrification of the building sector, which is speaking principally to what SEAM is offering.
Yeah, I mean, the hardware is all here, right? Like the hardware is more or less commoditized. I think why is it necessary for interoperability to exist? I mean, our building as they exist today, they're still pretty dumb, right? I mean, like they don't really like at Nest, like I remember when I signed my offer letter, the offer letter that was drafted by Matt and Tony, the two founder, basically said like, we are here to build the thoughtful home or the conscious home. I have some philosophical disagreement with conscious, but definitely thoughtful, right? And like the idea of like creating a thoughtful building is never going to happen until all the different systems kind of learn to talk to each other, talk to a central system. And where this system really operates more like, sort of a modern, application than sort of like a legacy piece of software that never really gets updated and doesn't really get smarter over time or even understands the concept of seasons or time of the day, these sort of things. So that's kind of why, like, if we're going to spend so much time inside of these buildings, if we're going to have so much of our GDP tied to, these buildings, it probably makes sense to think about how do we make them more thoughtful, smarter, more efficient. And so I think that's why like you kind of want like, have an API or have some sort of integration layer that ties everything together.
Yeah. Diving in a little bit more specifically to SEAM's technology, what is the principal problem that the API is solving?
Yeah. So when we came in, when we looked at the market, like we had this broad idea of like, hey, we want to provide an API for buildings. We want to provide effectively a programmatic interface to allow a software developer to interact with a physical piece of equipment. When we actually got into the details of understanding who are the software developers and what devices do they want to interact with, we saw a lot of use cases around like access to a building, thermostats and light management, right? Turning that stuff off after people are gone. And so the crux of the solution was then to understand like what devices enable you to accomplish sort of the goal of, yes, letting somebody inside of the building or turning off a thermostat when nobody is inside the Airbnb or whatever. And then understanding what does it take to actually talk to these devices. And so the solution that looking at the landscape, the solution we came up with is we have a small piece of hardware that is basically, you can think of it almost like as a Wi-Fi router. It's like a small gateway. That gateway is capable of connecting to many different types of devices. So it's multi-protocol ready. So it can speak Zigbee, it can speak Z-Wave, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. We're even starting to work on BACnet, which is kind of like a more traditional protocol for big buildings. And then this gateway is then talking to our cloud infrastructure, sort of reporting what's going on with each devices and exposing the functionality of these devices. And then our cloud infrastructure basically provides an API for, a software developer to be able to start controlling some of these devices. Now that whole sort of networking abstraction of like the gateway, the protocols, the cloud infrastructure, that stuff is pretty complicated. And so, when we came in, we saw a bunch of companies that were trying to build this when their primary business was not, being in the IoT space. They were, in the hotel space. They were ghost kitchens. And so it just kind of makes sense for them to instead kind of work with us and say, hey,
right.
the SIEM folks will figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You touched a little bit on this already, but I'd love to go into some use cases of the technology just to paint a picture of how this is used. You mentioned ghost kitchens, turning, adjusting appliances like HVAC, but could you describe a little bit more of those?
Yeah. So I'll probably pick like three off the top of my head. So a very common one we see again and again, less relevant for energy uses specifically, but we have, first few customers, basically they are sort of an Airbnb plus plus. They have folks that need to enter a building, enter a very specific unit inside of that building. And there's no front desk, there's no doorman, there's nobody there to sort of coordinate, a key exchange or anything of that nature. And so using SIEM, we actually connect to a bunch of the building access systems and individual door locks on some of the units. And then we can then program access for an individual between, a starting time and an end time. And all of that gets done automatically without, anybody having to go on site, without necessarily the company using us having to really think too hard about the details behind this. So, access is one thing. When I think about energy, there's a few things that we're already starting to see. So there's definitely hey, we want to be able to turn off the lights and the thermostats and that sort of stuff. I mean, that's pretty obvious at this point. The one that I find actually quite interesting is, and I believe this is mostly the case in Texas, but like you have a lot of wholesale electricity suppliers there, right? And these guys basically are trying to sort of spin up their own demand response programs. And in an ideal world, they want to be able to have sort of almost pseudo direct access to some of the devices inside of your homes or inside of some of the buildings. So HVAC is really the primary, energy consumption source, but you have other stuff, and especially with the rise of EVs and so forth, that's another one. So these companies, they're actually pretty smart, right? They have a bunch of software engineers in there. They're building really cool technology, but like they don't have the time to go and build an integration with every thermostat out there or every, EV chargers or lights or whatever. So what we're starting to see is these guys coming to us and saying like, hey, we see that you basically have an API to our customers' devices. Can we install you in our customer's home or in our customer's buildings, and then basically do a secure setup where now we can start, directly interacting with some of their devices once these customers join our demand response program.
Interesting. So in this case, the demand response provider would actually be the customer.
You mean our customer?
Your customer, or would it be that they serve as the conduit to adding more customers, being like building owners, home residents that are actually enrolled in their demand response programs?
Exactly. Yeah. So okay. We're really just an infrastructure layer. Like we're not going to move into the actual use case or application layer. So, if you have a utility like Reliant or SoCal Edison that wants to provide demand response and has a bunch of utility customers that are enrolled in that program, we're effectively a piece of infrastructure that lets them control more devices and do it, more rapidly.
Mm-hmm. I see. And just a quick note for any listeners that don't know what demand response is, it's basically demand response providers reduce a building's energy usage during a short window so they can balance the grid. essentially, and then they can get paid for that reduction of energy usage. But yeah, that's a really interesting example. I didn't consider that application. That makes a lot of sense, though, beyond just the ghost kitchens and Airbnbs, which makes so much sense, but these other more large scale applications to working in demand response.
Yeah.
Going back really quickly to, this is on accessibility, not energy related, but for the Airbnb example, which is fascinating, how do you ensure safety and privacy in these technologies? Like, what if somebody were able to get a hold of someone's account and they could unlock their door for them, for example?
Yeah, I mean, there's always kind of the joke that the S in IoT stands for security, right?
Right.
So it's actually, I think there's more than just security. There's also the privacy aspect to kind of take into consideration, right? Because conceptually, like, if you're able to connect to a number of devices, like door locks or whatnot, then at the end of the day, like, you can conceptually tell when people are coming in and out. And, in America, I think we're fortunate that, there's due process around accessing some of that data, but it's not necessarily the case in other parts of the world. And so I think you want to keep that in mind. So for Seam specifically, this was actually something that was pretty top of mind for us on day one. And again, it's based on the Nest experience. It's based on, personal sort of moral beliefs, I guess. So it's really, really tricky to, like, isolate, infrastructure and ensuring that, if one account gets leaked, how do you not leak additional accounts, or even ensuring that, like, we as a company don't necessarily get to see all the data in the world. I think the way we're going to be moving over time as a company is we're going to basically do end-to-end encryption, where basically a lot of data flows through our services, our backend services, but we don't necessarily get to really see what's in the data, right? It basically goes straight to the end customer. That's sort of like, I don't want to sort of make too many promises, because it's still really difficult to balance, like, having no visibility whatsoever on the data and ultimately still delivering value, right, to the customer. But I think end-to-end encryption is actually quite interesting, where we try to have as little data as possible, to retain as little data as possible. I think the other thing that we're doing is the gateway that we have, this physical piece of hardware device. Unlike a traditional Wi-Fi router, it's actually pretty beefy from a hardware spec standpoint. Right? It's got a CPU, it's got a lot of memory and all that sort of stuff. And so one of the the aspiration we also have is to run as much of the intelligence layer as possible onto the device itself. And the benefit of doing that is that you never really send data externally, right? Everything is local. So it's like, it's an additional step, I think, so to speak, in the right direction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, these are really interesting topics. What you were talking about with encryption, we see this happening in a lot across industries, especially in just communication today. People are more concerned about their privacy, their data, moving to different social and texting apps, and also edge computing and analytics on hardware devices. So that definitely fits with trends, I think, across technology, and very exciting to see where Seam goes with that. I wanted to just cover a little bit more about the business model and customers of Seam before we go into more of the nitty gritty, just understanding how Seam interact with different stakeholders across utilities. You mentioned demand response providers, building owners, and residents. Specifically, the last two, building owners and residents, like renters, I'm particularly interested in.
Yeah. So, and you want to know specifically the business model that we have so far today? Yeah.
Yeah, your business model.
Yeah. So the way, well, it's interesting. I think the way we started and where we are now is a bit different. So when we started, we're very much in the mindset of like, hey, our goal is to basically connect as many devices as possible and make them useful for our customers. And so we're going to charge, a monthly, service fee per device that is connected. That's still very much the case. But what we're seeing now is we've had a number of customers come to us and say, hey, it's great that you can control this, or you can connect this air quality monitor inside of this ghost kitchen or inside of this building for us. But actually what we want you to do is to do additional computation on top of the data that's coming out of these things, and then perform the following set of actions when, say, an air quality threshold gets crossed, or a temperature, sensor is triggered. And so I think where we're moving as a company is not just charge per device that is connected to our cloud infrastructure and is controllable and addressable and so forth, but it's also all the value, basically, that, like, making these devices useful, connecting them to third-party applications, taking actions, sending notifications. I think actually the crux of our business might ultimately long-term be more in that realm than just like charging an upfront fee. For the hardware itself, like, I mean, we do sell a piece of hardware, but it's not really where we make our money, to be blunt. I think it's more like the vision is to try to bring as many devices online as possible. So, with that said, like the actual hardware, the upfront cost, we basically try to keep it as low as possible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. That's great to have that overview. I'm wondering about what are the challenges in working in very old buildings with antiquated dinosaur devices? Working in a new structure where you can put in a whole new system of smart devices, smart IoT devices, IoT, Nest, all these things. That's one question, but going into these older homes, what are the challenges there?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, like, even the new buildings have challenges. But yeah, I mean, the older one is like, they'll have their regular subsystems, but usually, because the controller units or whatnot are much older, then you end up dealing with really antiquated serial protocols. And I think, quite frankly, like, I don't think you have to tear down a building in order to upgrade its internals. So I think what's actually probably likely to happen is I don't think there's going to be enough market pool for us to really go far back into the past as far as like connecting to really, really outdated systems. So I think actually the market's really going to say, like, hey, listen, like, this piece of infrastructure is 30 or 40 years old. Like, it's probably time to replace it, and replace it with something that's a little bit smarter. And I think that's kind of like how the market is going to evolve. I think the notion that some company somewhere is going to spend millions and millions of dollars kind of reverse engineering things that were done like 50 years ago is probably not going to happen, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in your time working in this space, both at SEAM and before, what trends are you seeing in the building management space, from smart homes to smart cities?
Yeah, there's a lot of trends. I mean, frankly, the main one is like these buildings, these places that we live in, they're coming online. It's not happening fast enough, but they're coming online, right? And I think the next question to ask is like, okay, but coming online for what? And again, that's when we go into the interoperability question, and making sure that now that these devices are controllable and addressable, in a remote manner, what is the universe of applications that we can basically leverage these devices for. And so it's going to be, in my opinion, it's going to be anything from like your DoorDash delivery and not having to even answer the door, things just get dropped off, or FedEx or UPS, to like, yeah, demand response, right? That's another one. I think you're probably even going to see things around like sort of fintech use cases. So, in insurance or in underwriting, basically, generally speaking, underwriting for insurance or capital partners, you're going to see these devices being bought online is effectively a new piece of information that can be used as part of not only the initial underwriting, but also the dynamic monitoring of the asset. And so I think, like, I think at some point, fairly soon various insurance companies and capital partners for the initial sort of loans that are being issued to construct a lot of these buildings or retrofit them. Like these guys are going to start taking into account some of that data as well.
Right. There's just going to be so much more data available.
Yeah. Well, it's not just more data; it's more useful data. It's a pretty big difference, right? And I think it's data upon which you can have effectively actionable insight, right?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying for the financial applications, when a building owner or resident is trying to retrofit some of their appliances or assets, previous history and data from their already existing appliances will come into play there.
Yeah, I think that's one thing, and then another one is I mean we have one customer that's coming to us where they're installing flood sensors inside of single family homes, and that's primarily because they're having issues with mold, they're having issues with water damage, and I think for them it's like or for an insurance, like the ability to monitor in real time what's happening inside of a building, tie that back to risk underwriting models, but also frankly like sort of incidents response, right, where it's like send like a maintenance team to go take care of it. Like I think all these things are, it's not just the past, it's also like in real time analysis of the risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Preventative measures as well, like you said, to prevent flooding or all these other things. It's on one hand convenience and comfort, the direction that these smart homes are going in. Like you drive in your electric vehicle and the elevator in your apartment building is already descending and the lights are turning on and the door is unlocking as you're approaching. All these different things that are convenient and make living very comfortable, but there's so many other health, safety, and environmental sustainability considerations there too, which are very exciting. Yeah. I think just going like in the next 5-10 years, so much is going to change. The building space is really ripe for innovation. So another question I had for you is about differentiation and how SEAM thinks about itself vis-a-vis other technology providers, and why, like, how is SEAM different? Is anybody else working on similar things with APIs, that kind of differentiation?
Yeah. So there's definitely a lot of very verticalized solutions, right? Where it's like, it's like a product, hardware plus software plus, application stack that does one thing. And we've seen, there's some good examples of that. Density, actually, to some extent, it's kind of like monitoring of a physical space. What I don't think we've seen yet is more of a, hey, we're going to try to glue all these individual systems together, and basically provide an interface, like a generalized interface to these systems, so that anybody from a building owner to maybe like a SaaS, a software as a service platform can now start to talk to these devices in the same way that, say, you can talk to, you can do credit card processing with Stripe, or connect your bank account with Plaid, or, send a text message with Twilio, right? So I don't think we've really seen somebody that, quite frankly, is kind of crazy enough to try to go after like an API for buildings, but there's definitely like individual solutions out there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I asked that question because I see a lot of technologies offering alerts and tracking for residents or building owners on, hey, like let's say your washing machine is on right now, but it's a peak demand hour, wait and do it later, or something in the evening when there's less demand, and alerts like that. But more and more devices making things easier and more consumer interface, but that actual connective tissue that SEAM offers, I have not seen before. So that's very, very interesting. I want to backtrack a little bit and hear about the journey of founding with Dawn this company, and what was your thought process when both of you were coming from Nest and Sonder, thinking, hey, let's figure out something different and leave these, you know, well-respected large companies and do our own endeavor, which is very exciting, but also probably scary.
Yeah, especially when you started, you know, right when a global pandemic hits the, the economy. That was not the smartest time to get started, but you know, we sort of kind of muscled through, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you know, the, the personas first, right? I mean, I think Donna and I were you know, we're pretty interested in like cities and kind of like how can we make them more thoughtful, and same for the buildings we live in. And you know, we love to hack on our own houses and just do things to them. Dawn, I have a photo of her reading like an infrastructure book, textbook from college, where she's just reading about like, I don't know, the energy grid. It's like, who reads this, you know, before going to sleep?
Right.
Yeah, it's like, I think we were kind of like, you know, despite sort of coming from the software side, I think we were kind of nerding out on the idea of like, there's a physical world out there, and you know, somehow we could like bring, you know, the internet is still mostly a digital technology to this day. And so if we could somehow expand the reach of the internet into the physical world, that would be a very interesting idea. With respect to like where we were before, I mean, Dawn was running the IoT team for Sonder, right? She was, you know, directly responsible for ensuring that, you know, when Sonder would take over an entire building and turn it into sort of a pseudo hotel, you know, they don't have any front desk staff. They don't have any staff on site, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know. And so, you know, her job was like, hey, like, how do I get people from basically the street level into their room using nothing but, you know, a bunch of smart locks and, you know, an iPhone, you know, for the most part. And I think like through that journey, she saw like, you know, it may be, you know, 2018, 2019 at a time, but it's still really difficult to control these smart objects, despite their, you know, despite the fact that they're ubiquitously available. It's still really, really difficult as a software engineer that really can code to like actually connect these things and make them do things. And in parallel, I had a bunch of friends that were doing sort of like open door type of concepts for like real estate and self tours and whatever. And they were telling us the same thing. And, you know, when Don and I were kind of like chit chatting about this issue, we're like, you know, it's like access definitely still needs to be, is still an issue. But like, even coming from the world of Nest and energy, like we know there's a bunch of energy stuff that need to be done. And it's not going to be one company that like figures out everything under the sun. There's too many devices, there's too many utilities out there. But what would be very valuable for the market is if there was an abstraction layer that makes it really easy for all the utilities to talk to all the different devices that are out there and kind of finally do something useful, right? And so I think, you know, we kind of thought about it, and you know, we had a pretty good sense of what the solution probably would need to look like as software engineer, as frankly users of our own, you know, tools and services. And so I think in February or March of 2020 is, I think, when we said, you know, we're doing this. And I remember specifically, I think I'd gone to Austin to go see, you know, a company whose CEO is now one of our investor, but I went to see them and to kind of show them like an initial prototype that Dawn and I had built. And I was on the way back to San Francisco in the airport, and Dawn just texted me. She's like, "I just quit my job. We're gonna go do this." And I was like, "Really? Like this?" So yeah, it's kind of where we started, and then you know, we went through YC over the summer, and then we've been fortunate to raise a round since then. So we're definitely doing this now.
Yeah. I mean, when Dawn pulled the plug of her other job, that's full commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as a entrepreneur, I'm like, what are some insights you've gleaned from the process, you know, technology aside, but the journey of founding your company with a co-founder. What have been, some insights, any challenges that you've overcome?
Yeah. Maybe don't try to start a company at the start of a pandemic. I mean, it's just like,
February
again,
1st,
like,
that's exactly when.
yeah, that might be a once in a lifetime type of concern. So
Noted.
hopefully,
I should do that in the future.
yeah. No, um, I think what's super important is, if you're gonna go start a company, like make sure it's meaningful to you, and that you can sort of reason as to why. Um, it's like I remember when Google acquired Nest, Larry Page, the CEO and the founder of Google at the time, came to talk to us, and I remember he said this sort of kind of thing that kind of stuck with me through the years, which was, um, if you have all this money at your disposal, like it would be kind of sad if you do something kind of silly with it, like. Not to talk down on Instagram or anything like this, but like basically another photo sharing app or what have you. And so I think like in the context of Seam, the reality is we probably spent like north of 2 years actually kind of thinking through what to work on next. This whole concept of wanting to be part of smarter cities, smarter buildings, like what's the entry point? How does that work? Why is it meaningful to us? And so I think like if somebody is out there like kind of thinking like, oh, I want to start a company, like I think it's a very glamorous idea on paper, but you have to know like the going gets really, really tough. For Seam, like we've been super fortunate, things are good. My previous company did not go well inside, various points in time. And it's just like, you got to make sure that like, when your back is against the wall, you still want to get up in the morning. This is what you want to go do. And I think that, I love working with Dawn, and I love our team that we have now, and I love what we do. And so I think like that sort of fulfillment didn't happen by accident, right? It was just a long, thoughtful process of like what is meaningful to work on. So I think that's super important. I think a lot of people think that like starting a company is super risky. I think it's actually a lot less risky than it used to be. There's a lot of capital out there, to be honest. Peter Thiel was one of my professor. Like he taught one course, at Stanford, one quarter, and I remember him sort of saying like, people tend to overestimate how much risk they're really taking, and generally speaking, like if you think you're taking too much risk, you're probably actually not taking enough. And I think like, yeah, if somebody is like really wants to work on something, but they think it's too risky, it's probably actually not that risky. And the fact that they want to work on it so bad, like is actually like probably way more likely to make them successful, which further de-risk the whole thing. So, I don't know if I have like a whole lot of other, sort of like insights or whatever, but I really sort of like encourage whenever people say, oh, I'm going to start a company, what do you think about this or that? Like my first question is usually why you, like, what's like the intrinsic, drive to want to go do this?
Right. Yeah. I read 0 to 1, and there's a lot of really interesting by Peter Thiel, and
the
idea of risk is very interesting. Exactly what you were saying. We're inherently risk averse, but success, like extreme success, comes from taking big risks. So that's definitely a good lesson. You mentioned that you started a company before this as well, but it didn't work out. What were some of those reasons?
We're gonna need another hour.
Or high level takeaways, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, it was a point in time when we were building a marketplace at the time. It's frankly something that I don't find that meaningful. Say what?
Was this Instamotor?
Yeah. And it's not something that, I think like 3 years in or so, like when the going got tough, and it's like now you keep growing and growing, but you always got to grow more, and you got to justify your valuation and all that sort of stuff. Like, things were definitely not fun anymore. And I think that to some extent, like what we were working on as a company wasn't that meaningful to me. And so I think there was a bit of like, okay, like, you know, there's just a collection of an ensemble of things where it's like, it probably just makes sense to sort of pass this on. So the entity itself was actually still being run by another company that basically purchased everything. But like, I wouldn't ascribe to that. Actually, I think what was good, what came out of that experience is really sort of like highlighting the need to go find something that brings you like a lot of peace internally, that, you know, this is really what I want to go do every day. And I think like for Seam, you know, I understand if most people don't find like low-level hardware protocols like sexy or anything like this. For me, it's appealing. It's just like I like the idea of like trying to make buildings smarter, and I like thinking about the whole technology stack. I like to think about the security and privacy angle of it. I really, really, I'm very attached to this idea of again, like trying to provide a programmatic interface to the physical world, right? Like, I think if we really nail this out, like it's conceptually a very, very important idea to work on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Has that passion been with you for some time? Like, is that the reason why you joined Nest in the first place? Like that interest in buildings and...
Yeah.
Or did Nest create that interest?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think like I joined when I joined Nest, right? It was still like fairly early there, and you know, I didn't necessarily have like this idea that I was just generally going to go into like smart buildings or that sort of stuff. But I do remember like actually before joining Nest, this was when I was a college student, but just kind of thinking like, what would it mean for a smart grid to exist? And like, how would you get like throttle real-time consumption and all that sort of stuff? It just happened that Nest was working on a lot of these things, but that was entirely the reason I joined them. I joined Nest because I remember going into the building, and, you know, there was maybe like 40, 50 folks at the time there. So it wasn't like tiny, but it also wasn't massive. And the folks that were there were basically the people who brought you the iPod and the iPhone and a bunch of other, you know, really great consumer devices. And then there were even folks, you know, individuals who had sold their companies, you know, for billions of dollars actually as founders, right? I mean, they were very well off. And they were there sort of working as kind of like a frontline engineer. And I was like, man, I gotta come here. Like, this is like a weird place. Like, why all these people here?
Right.
You know, this is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, the draw was like kind of this vision of like, again, trying to create a thoughtful home. And
Right.
I think like that's kind of where the rest sort of kicked in.
Yeah, no, I think you're so right that the people environment is so important, not only in picking a job, but also like in a startup. Like, it's great that you and Don have a good founder relationship, co-founder relationship, it sounds, because I know that's a challenge, going through thick and thin with another person. It really tests the friendship and business working relationship.
Yeah, and I'm still best friend with my previous co-founder from my previous company.
Good.
So at least like that part was super.
Good.
That was probably like the best thing that came out of it.
Like breakup, like startup co-founder breakups are worse sometimes than
like
relationship breakups, and yeah, it's messy sometimes. But that's so good that you're close friends.
Yeah.
I'd like to end the podcast by hearing a little bit about you. So here's a fun question. What is something that we wouldn't know about you from looking at your resume or listening to this podcast?
It's probably a few things, hopefully.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think like maybe before we started earlier, like we're chatting, like I grew up in a tiny village up in the French Alps on the border of Italy and Switzerland. And it's sometimes I'm kind of amused that I'm now sort of like in technology and kind of working like on buildings inside of cities and whatever, because like where I grew up originally, it's like my neighbor had 20 cows, you know, and it's just like we had no TV, and you know it was lovely up there, but not exactly the center of the technological world. So yeah, that might be one.
Yeah.
You know.
When did you move from?
We moved to Texas first, and I think I was like 12, something
Okay.
like this. I barely remember. I wasn't super young, but I don't remember that much of it. I just remember like, yeah, it was like French Alps, Texas. It was just like,
couldn't be more different. What a
yeah.
Yeah, and that's really interesting though, being in the heart of Silicon Valley and thinking back to where you're from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so much thinking even about US kind of tech entrepreneur culture compared to Europe, where that also exists for sure, but it's very different.
Yeah. It's coming up out there. I think like, I mean, I don't have any memory of it when I was a kid, but I've sort of seen like at a distance, like at least the Paris and the London and the Berlin scene kind of evolving. And, if you go to Paris now, they have Station F, which is this massive startup campus. It's like basically the size of a Google, headquarter campus, but you have thousands of startups in there, and it's like almost like a mini like Silicon Valley ecosystem. So I think it's actually pretty good for it's it's not necessarily bad for San Francisco that like, other places are coming up, but I think it's definitely good for the world as a whole that like there are more centers of innovation where like this whole idea of software first companies kind of takes roots. And we can't, it is irresponsible to have every, smart software engineer and whatnot be here in Silicon Valley. I think it's important that we're all over.
Absolutely, especially even for the city of San Francisco itself, like skyrocketing real estate prices. There's not enough room. It's a small city as well, and yeah, there's so many innovators, entrepreneurs around the world. Let's have hubs everywhere, which is already existing. It's like Tel Aviv. Look at Tel Aviv, for example.
Yeah.
Startup Central.
Yeah. Taipei is another good one in Taiwan. Yeah.
Really
all these places are coming up, and I think like ideally I think it's in PhD programs there's always like in research there's this idea of cross pollination, right, where you tend to prefer to not take somebody who went to Stanford for undergrad and move them straight into a Stanford PhD program. You want to sort of send them somewhere else. And I think we kind of want the same thing for tech in general. I think that'll be good for the ecosystem.
Yeah, generally just spreading ideas and insights across geographies, for sure. Great. Well, thank you so much, Sai, for your time. This has been great to get to know you a bit better, hear your story, and also all about SEAM and the exciting technology it is bringing to the building management sector. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
For sure.